Did you know that the average person needs 7 to 10 minutes to fall asleep under ideal conditions? But when your mind is stuck on an existential loop worthy of Rick Sanchez himself, that time can stretch into hours of tossing and turning. This video transforms Rick and Morty's chaotic multiverse adventures into a chronological sleep journey, starting all the way back with the pilot when Rick first moved in with the Smith family. We've preserved all the philosophical questions about free will and determinism that make the show great, but delivered them at exactly the right pace to help your consciousness fade into peaceful sleep. Have you ever wondered what Rick and Morty's very first adventure would sound like when transformed into a gentle bedtime story? It all begins with an old man stumbling into his daughter's home in the middle of the night, disrupting what had been, up until that point, a perfectly ordinary suburban existence. That man is Rick Sanchez, a scientific genius whose alcohol-laden breath and constant belching punctuate nearly every sentence he speaks. The Smith family doesn't quite know what to make of this eccentric grandfather who's suddenly moved into their garage, transforming it into a laboratory filled with bizarre contraptions and glowing substances that defy the laws of physics. We're introduced to the entire Smith family in these early moments. Beth, Rick's daughter who clearly harbors deep-seated abandonment issues from her father's absence during her childhood. Jerry, her insecure husband who immediately senses a threat to his tenuous authority in the household. Summer, the teenage daughter preoccupied with her social standing. And finally Morty, the anxious, stuttering 14-year-old boy who becomes the unwitting companion to his grandfather's interdimensional escapades. The dynamic is established almost immediately when Rick wakes Morty in the middle of the night, dragging him from his bed with urgent whispers about a mission of the utmost importance. Morty, bleary-eyed and confused, follows along as he always will, establishing the pattern that will define their relationship. There's something almost hypnotic about the way Rick speaks, a mixture of scientific jargon, casual profanity, and nihilistic observations about the universe that somehow manages to be both jarring and oddly comforting when narrated at a slower pace. Their destination is Dimension C-137, a reality not so different from our own except for one crucial detail: the megaseeds that Rick is desperate to acquire. These seeds aren't just any ordinary objects. They contain properties that can significantly boost intelligence, if only temporarily. The journey to retrieve them takes our unlikely duo through a surreal landscape of alien flora and fauna, creatures with anatomies that defy explanation and colors that shouldn't exist in nature. What makes this initial adventure so compelling as a sleep story is the way it introduces us to the vastness of the multiverse. Rick casually mentions infinite realities, each with its own version of Earth and everyone on it. There's something strangely comforting about the concept of infinite possibilities when you're trying to disconnect from the anxieties of your singular reality. If there are infinite versions of you making every possible choice, perhaps the pressure of any single decision diminishes into cosmic insignificance. The moral complexity begins to emerge when Rick and Morty encounter the interdimensional customs facility. This mundane, bureaucratic process in the midst of cosmic chaos creates a wonderfully absurd juxtaposition. Aliens of all shapes and sizes wait in line, filling out forms, submitting to scans, all under the watchful eyes of insectoid officers wielding intimidating weaponry. When they're inevitably discovered, Rick's solution reveals the first truly troubling aspect of his character. He instructs Morty to shove the mega seeds into, well, a very uncomfortable bodily cavity for smuggling purposes. This moment establishes something crucial about Rick: his willingness to use Morty as a tool rather than treating him as a person deserving of dignity and respect. It's the first glimpse of Rick's utilitarian approach to relationships, where people are valued primarily for their usefulness rather than their inherent worth. When narrated slowly and thoughtfully, this moral complexity becomes less about shock value and more about contemplating the nature of care and exploitation in relationships. The chase sequence that follows would be frenetic and chaotic on screen, but when described in a soothing voice, it transforms into something more dreamlike, almost surreal. The portal gun makes its first appearance, Rick's signature invention that allows him to tear open doorways between dimensions with a casual flick of his wrist. The green swirling vortices create convenient escape routes, but they also represent something deeper: Rick's perpetual ability to avoid consequences, to literally escape any situation by simply stepping into another reality. When they finally return home, the mega seeds have begun to dissolve inside Morty, temporarily granting him extraordinary intelligence. This creates one of the episode's most interesting dynamics. For a brief moment, Morty and Rick are intellectual equals, capable of discussing complex scientific concepts. But the effect is fleeting, and Morty experiences a painful crash that leaves him incapacitated on the floor, twitching and drooling. Rick reveals that this entire adventure was essentially a test run, the first of many such missions he plans to drag Morty on. The episode concludes with Rick's now iconic monologue about Rick and Morty, forever and forever, 100 years, a rambling, seemingly nonsensical declaration that becomes oddly prophetic about the series itself. There's something almost incantatory about these words when spoken slowly, like a strange lullaby promising adventures beyond imagination. What makes the pilot episode particularly well-suited as a sleep story is the way it introduces cosmic vastness while remaining anchored in family dynamics. The universe may be infinite and meaningless according to Rick, but the Smith household remains a constant center point, a place of return. This tension between the infinite and the intimate creates a philosophical space perfect for contemplation as you drift towards sleep. The concepts introduced, infinite realities, the meaninglessness of individual existence in a boundless cosmos, the arbitrary nature of social structures, might seem anxiety-inducing at first glance. But when stripped of their frantic presentation and narrated in a calm, measured voice, they transform into philosophical questions that actually help detach the mind from immediate concerns. If there are infinite realities where every possible outcome occurs, perhaps the weight of any single day's worries begins to feel lighter. While the pilot episode introduced us to the vastness of the multiverse as a concept, Rick Potion number 9 forces us to confront its darkest implications. This pivotal episode marks the moment when Rick and Morty permanently abandon their original universe, casually stepping over their own dead bodies to resume lives that aren't technically theirs. It all begins with a seemingly innocent request. Morty, caught in the throes of teenage infatuation, asks Rick for a love potion to win over his high school crush Jessica. Despite knowing better, Rick agrees to help, creating a chemical that works by altering pheromone perception. At first, the potion seems to work perfectly. Jessica becomes instantly attracted to Morty. But there's a complication neither of them anticipated. It's flu season. When Jessica sneezes, the love potion combines with the flu virus and becomes airborne, spreading to everyone at the school dance. Soon, the entire school is madly in love with Morty, creating a chaotic scene as everyone fights to be near him. Rick attempts to fix the situation with a counter potion, but his solution only makes things worse. Instead of restoring people to normal, it transforms them into grotesque mantis-like creatures that still remain obsessively in love with Morty. Rick's second attempt at a cure proves even more disastrous. The new formula interacts with the mantis DNA and the flu virus, creating what Rick calls Cronenberg monsters, horrifying inside-out blob creatures that overrun the entire planet. In a particularly unsettling twist, the only people immune to these transformations are Morty's blood relatives, leaving the Smith family as the sole normal humans in a world gone mad. What makes this episode particularly haunting is how it transforms abstract concepts from the pilot into devastating reality. The idea of infinite realities suddenly takes on a much darker dimension when we witness Rick and Morty actually abandoning their home universe. After failing to reverse the genetic catastrophe they've caused, Rick casually reveals there's a simple solution. They'll just move to an alternate reality where they solved the crisis but died immediately afterward in an unrelated accident. This moment represents a fundamental shift in the show's approach to its multiverse concept. It's no longer just a convenient plot device for adventures, but becomes a central element in understanding the character's psychology. Rick's nonchalance about jumping to a new reality suggests he's done this before, perhaps many times, hinting at deeper issues with attachment and responsibility. For Morty, this experience creates a profound trauma as he's forced to bury his own corpse and take over the life of an alternate version of himself. The scene where Rick and Morty bury their own bodies in the backyard is accompanied by Mazzy Star's haunting song, Look On Down from the Bridge, creating one of the series' most somber and philosophical moments. The visual of Morty shoveling dirt onto his own face while contemplating what this means for his identity is both disturbing and deeply thought-provoking. As viewers, we're left to wonder what happens to your sense of self when you've literally buried your own corpse and taken its place. This episode establishes one of the show's most important philosophical premises, that actions have permanent consequences, even in a multiverse of infinite possibilities. Despite Rick's ability to access countless realities, he can't undo the damage they've caused. Their original world remains forever Cronenberged, abandoned to its fate. The universe doesn't offer do-overs, only the option to run away and start again somewhere else, carrying the psychological burden of what you've done. For Morty, this experience represents the first major crack in his innocence. He begins to understand the true weight of adventuring with Rick, not just the danger to himself, but the catastrophic consequences their actions can have for entire worlds. When he later references this event in future episodes, it's clear the experience has fundamentally changed him, making him more cynical but also more aware of the moral implications of their adventures. Rick's explanation that they can only perform this reality switch a couple of times adds another layer of dread to the situation. Even with infinite realities available, there are limits to how often they can escape the consequences of their actions. This constraint forces viewers to consider the weight of choices in a way that pure nihilism doesn't. Even in an infinite multiverse, accountability still exists in some form. What's particularly interesting about this episode in the context of a sleep story is how its cosmic horror elements transform when narrated in a soothing voice. The existential dread of abandoning an entire universe becomes a contemplative philosophical exercise. The realization that there are infinite realities where things went differently provides a strange comfort. Somewhere, things worked out better. Somewhere, mistakes weren't made. This perspective can actually help detach the mind from immediate anxieties, creating a mental space conducive to drifting off to sleep. The writers have noted the importance of Rick Potion number 9 to the series' mythology, as it establishes fundamental truths about consequences and identity that echo throughout later seasons. It sets the stage for understanding Rick's deeper character issues. His casual attitude about universe hopping suggests a lack of emotional attachment that hints at profound psychological damage. Just when Rick's casual approach to universe hopping revealed glimpses of his damaged psyche, we're taken somewhere far more unsettling. A civilization built by the one person Rick can't stand, himself. Imagine discovering that across infinite dimensions, thousands of Ricks have gathered to form their own society, complete with a government, social hierarchy, and an economy. This is the Citadel of Ricks, and it's where our story takes us next. In close Rick counters of the Rick kind, our Rick faces perhaps his most personal challenge yet, when he's forcibly dragged before the Council of Ricks, a governing body composed of Ricks from various dimensions. They don't come bearing gifts, they come with accusations. According to them, our Rick has been traveling across dimensions, murdering other Ricks and kidnapping their Mortys. It's a serious charge, especially coming from an organization that our Rick despises on principle. The introduction of this council reveals something fundamental about Rick's character. Here's a man who rejects all authority, who considers himself uniquely brilliant, now confronted with a room full of himself. Each council member shares his face, his genius, and his arrogance, yet our Rick considers himself above them all. This isn't just ego, it's a fascinating glimpse into Rick's self-loathing. He hates other versions of himself more than anyone else, seeing in them reflections of his own worst qualities. What makes this episode particularly intriguing for a sleep story is how it expands the show's cosmology while raising profound questions about identity. If you're one of infinite versions of yourself, what makes you special? What defines your uniqueness when countless variations of you exist across dimensions? These philosophical questions create a soothing backdrop for contemplation as you drift towards sleep. As Rick investigates to clear his name, we discover one of the most disturbing aspects of the Rick and Morty relationship. Throughout the Citadel, Mortys aren't treated as family members or even as people. They're tools. The episode reveals that Mortys serve a specific purpose. Their brainwaves create a camouflage pattern that masks the genius waves emitted by Rick's, essentially making them living shields. This revelation forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about why Rick brings Morty on adventures. Picture discovering that across infinite realities, your only purpose was to serve as a walking, talking brainwave shield for someone else. This is the existential horror Morty confronts at the Citadel, learning that most Ricks view their Mortys as expendable, interchangeable, and replaceable. Our Morty witnesses firsthand how other Mortys are treated, as commodities to be traded, as servants to be ordered around, even as livestock to be harvested for their utility. The most haunting image comes when Rick and Morty discover a hidden dome filled with thousands of Mortys in constant pain. Their suffering produces brainwaves that shield the activities of the true culprit behind the murders. This dome of tortured Mortys serves as a disturbing visual metaphor for exploitation, raising uncomfortable ethical questions about using innocence for personal gain. As we narrate this scene in a gentle voice, the horror transforms into a meditation on the nature of cruelty and power. During their investigation, Rick and Morty encounter what appears to be a Morty who's been controlling an evil Rick, though we don't yet know the full truth of this character. This Morty, later revealed to be Evil Morty, makes his first appearance here, establishing one of the show's most significant long-term antagonists. His presence hints at deeper mysteries within the multiverse and suggests that Mortys aren't necessarily destined to remain subservient to their Ricks. Evil Morty's introduction is handled subtly in this episode. We don't yet know his true nature or his long-term plans, but the seeds are planted for a mythology that will unfold across subsequent seasons. His existence challenges the established power dynamic between Ricks and Mortys, suggesting the possibility of rebellion against predetermined roles. What elevates this episode beyond its sci-fi trappings is how it examines our Rick's relationship with our Morty. Throughout the adventure, we're given hints that our Rick is somehow different from the others. While most Ricks see Mortys as disposable tools, our Rick shows moments of genuine concern for his Morty's well-being. He becomes visibly upset when seeing Mortys being mistreated, suggesting that despite his gruff exterior, he's developed a connection that transcends the utilitarian relationship other Ricks have with their Mortys. This idea, that our Rick is different, becomes a central theme that resonates throughout the series. It raises questions about nature versus nurture, about whether a person can transcend their inherent tendencies through choice and connection. If Rick is capable of caring about Morty beyond his usefulness as a brainwave shield, what does that say about Rick's potential for growth and change? The Citadel itself becomes a character in this episode. It's a place where Ricks have created their own society, complete with infrastructure, social strata, and governance. But it's also a physical manifestation of Rick's self-loathing, a place where he's confronted with infinite versions of himself, each one reminding him of aspects of his personality he'd rather not acknowledge. The Citadel represents Rick's inability to escape himself, no matter how many dimensions he travels to. As the truth behind the murders is revealed and our Rick clears his name, he's offered membership in the Council, an offer he predictably rejects. Rick's refusal to join the other Ricks highlights his resistance to being categorized or controlled, even by versions of himself. He chooses to remain an outsider, maintaining his unique bond with Morty rather than subscribing to the utilitarian view held by his counterparts. The philosophical depth of this episode makes it perfect for contemplative pre-sleep listening. When stripped of its frenetic animation and presented in a soothing voice, the story transforms into a meditation on identity, free will, and the nature of relationships. Are we defined by our circumstances? Can we choose connections that transcend utility? What makes us unique in a universe of infinite possibilities? What happens when the very foundation of your memories becomes suspect? In Total Rickle, we're confronted with perhaps the most unsettling invasion yet, one that doesn't attack the body but rewrites the mind itself. Memory parasites infiltrate the Smith household, implanting false recollections so convincing that everyone believes these fictional characters have always been part of their lives. It's a brilliant premise that asks us to consider: if our memories shape our identity, what happens when we can't trust them at all? The episode opens with the family and Uncle Steve having breakfast together. except Rick suddenly shoots Uncle Steve, revealing him as a memory parasite. This sets up the central conflict. These parasites multiply by implanting false memories, making it impossible to distinguish who's real and who's fabricated. Each time someone reminisces about another character, a new parasite appears, gradually filling the house with increasingly absurd personalities like photography raptor, pencil vester, and reverse giraffe. What makes this episode particularly effective for a sleep story is how it uses flashbacks as a storytelling device. These sequences flow like dreams, warm, nostalgic moments that feel familiar yet slightly off. We see the family going to the zoo with Sleepy Gary, Summer's slumber party with Tinkles, the magical ballerina lamb, and Rick's adventures with Ghost in a Jar. Each memory feels genuine despite being completely fabricated, creating a dreamlike quality perfect for transitioning into actual sleep. The parasite's strategy is particularly insidious because they only create positive memories. Rick's scientific explanation of their methodology becomes wonderfully soothing when narrated slowly. These creatures insert themselves into existing neural pathways, fabricating connections that never existed while making the host genuinely believe these memories are their own. The technical breakdown of memory formation and alteration creates a fascinating backdrop to the chaotic events unfolding. What makes this episode truly compelling is the philosophical dimension it explores. Is a false happy memory preferable to a real painful one? The parasites offer a seductive alternative reality, one where the Smith family's life is filled with magical adventures and supportive friends. In many ways, these fabricated relationships seem more fulfilling than their actual dysfunctional family dynamic. When Beth believes Sleepy Gary is her husband instead of Jerry, she appears happier in this delusion than in her actual marriage. The breakthrough comes when Rick realizes something crucial about the parasites. They can only create positive memories. This insight leads to the episode's most profound moment, the understanding that real relationships necessarily include negative emotions. The family begins testing each person by recalling bad memories they've shared. We see Beth shooting Rick during a drunken Christmas, Rick making Morty cry on his birthday, and Summer and Morty fighting over a broken television. These painful recollections become the verification of authentic bonds. This realization carries significant philosophical weight when contemplated before sleep. Real relationships aren't defined by consistent happiness, but by the full spectrum of emotions they contain. The argument you had with your friend, the disappointment you caused a loved one, the times you were hurt by someone you care about. These painful memories aren't flaws in your relationships, but essential components that validate their authenticity. There's something oddly comforting in recognizing that our imperfect connections are what make them real. As the family tests each character with negative memories, they systematically eliminate the parasites in increasingly violent fashion. The contrast between the saccharine flashbacks and the brutal extermination creates a fascinating juxtaposition. Each parasite, when exposed, reverts to its true alien form, a grotesque insect-like creature begging for its life by desperately trying to conjure more happy memories. Remember the barbecue? One pleads before being shot. This transition from beloved character to revealed monster creates a satisfying rhythm that works surprisingly well as a sleep narrative. The episode's most brilliant twist comes at the end when Beth shoots Mr. Poopy Butthole, assuming he must be a parasite, only to discover he's actually real when he bleeds and is rushed to the hospital. Despite his absurd name and appearance that seem to mark him as an obvious parasite, Mr. Poopy Butthole was genuine all along. This subversion plays with our expectations as viewers and reinforces the episode's theme about memory's unreliability. Sometimes the most implausible elements of our lives are entirely real. The final hospital scene shows Mr. Poopy Butthole recovering from his gunshot wound, telling the traumatized Beth, "I'm sorry you didn't have any bad memories of me." This poignant line reinforces the episode's central insight, that painful memories authenticate our relationships. Mr. Poopy Butthole was such a positive presence that the family had no negative experiences to verify his existence, leading to their mistaken assumption. When transformed into a sleep story, the chaotic house full of parasites becomes a meditation on human connection. The frantically multiplying characters create a dreamlike quality when described in a soothing voice. Characters like Reverse Giraffe, with a short neck and legs, and Ghost in a Jar become oddly comforting presences, like Counting Sheep but with bizarre Rick and Morty creations instead. The family's methodical process of identifying real members through shared negative experiences becomes almost hypnotic when narrated at a slow, gentle pace. What makes this episode particularly effective for pre-sleep listening is how it transforms something potentially unsettling, memory parasites, into a contemplative exploration of what makes relationships meaningful. The story becomes less about the sci-fi concept and more about the insight that authentic bonds contain both joy and pain. As you drift towards sleep, this reflection on the nature of memory and connection creates the perfect mental space for letting go of the day's concerns. Ever wondered what could possibly be important enough to make Rick Sanchez, a man who regularly escapes death, overthrows governments, and creates life, willingly walk into captivity? In The Rick Shank Redemption, we discover that Rick's surrender to the Galactic Federation isn't just a shocking plot twist, but the opening move in an elaborate chess game where every action reveals another layer of his mysterious past. The episode begins with Rick imprisoned by the Galactic Federation, the bureaucratic interstellar government that represents everything he despises. What makes this situation particularly fascinating is that Rick has voluntarily surrendered himself, an apparently selfless act to protect his family. But nothing with Rick is ever that straightforward. As he sits in his cell, we begin to understand that his imprisonment is actually part of a much larger strategy. The Federation is desperate to extract the secret of Rick's portal technology, which would give them unprecedented power to expand their control throughout the multiverse. Their interrogation methods involve plugging into Rick's brain using a device that creates a simulated reality where they can navigate his memories. This is where Rick begins to demonstrate why he's considered the smartest being in the universe. He's not just resisting their efforts, he's actively manipulating the simulation to serve his own purposes. While inside this mind simulation, we're presented with what appears to be Rick's origin story. We see scenes of a younger Rick working on portal technology when another Rick from an alternate dimension arrives, killing his wife Diane and daughter Beth with a bomb. This tragic backstory seemingly explains Rick's deep-seated nihilism and his constant dimension hopping. He's been hunting the Rick who murdered his family. The brilliance of this narrative lies in its layers of deception. Just when we think we finally understand what drives Rick, the episode pulls the rug out from under us. Rick reveals to a Federation agent that the entire backstory was fabricated, a completely made-up origin story designed to trick his captors. This revelation creates a fascinating uncertainty about Rick's true past that continues to haunt the series for seasons to come. We're left wondering, if this story isn't true, then what really happened to make Rick the way he is? What makes this episode particularly suited for pre-sleep listening is the methodical way Rick dismantles both the Federation and the Council of Ricks. There's something oddly soothing about watching a master strategist execute a plan with such precision. Rick manipulates the Federation agent into transferring his consciousness first into the agent's body, then into a high-ranking member of the Council. From there, he systematically takes down both organizations by transferring the value of the Federation's currency to zero, causing an economic collapse and simultaneously destroying the citadel of Ricks. The technical explanations Rick provides throughout this process, detailing how he transfers his consciousness and manipulates the Federation's central banking system, become almost hypnotic when narrated slowly. The complexity of his plan unfolds like a lullaby of scientific ingenuity, allowing listeners to appreciate the intricate details of his escape while drifting towards sleep. Amidst this high-stakes prison break narrative, the episode introduces one of the show's most absurdist elements: Rick's obsession with McDonald's Szechuan sauce. This limited-time promotional sauce for the 1998 release of Disney's Mulan becomes Rick's stated motivation for his actions. "That's what this is all about, Morty," Rick declares in the episode's closing moments. "That's my series arc. I'm not driven by avenging my dead family. I'm driven by finding that McNugget sauce." This fixation creates a brilliant contrast to the episode's otherwise serious tone. While Rick is dismantling galactic governments and confronting existential questions about his past, he's simultaneously obsessed with a discontinued fast food condiment. This juxtaposition perfectly encapsulates the show's ability to blend profound philosophical concepts with absurdist humor. The sauce obsession also serves as a fascinating commentary on consumer culture and nostalgia. Rick, despite having access to infinite realities and technologies beyond human comprehension, fixates on recapturing a specific taste from his past. There's something deeply human about this desire. Even the most brilliant mind in the universe isn't immune to the pull of nostalgia. Throughout the episode, we see Rick's complex relationship with authority play out in fascinating ways. The Galactic Federation represents the ultimate bureaucratic system, rigid, rule-bound, and controlling. Rick's hatred for this type of authority stems from his belief in absolute freedom and his refusal to be contained by any system. When he brings down the Federation, it's not just a prison break, it's a philosophical statement about his worldview. The episode concludes with Rick declaring his darkness to Morty, setting up his character arc for future seasons. "I'm a terrible person, and I know it," Rick admits, revealing a self-awareness that complicates our understanding of his character. Despite his brilliance and his ability to achieve virtually anything he wants across the multiverse, Rick remains haunted by his own nature. This inner conflict makes Rick a fascinating character to contemplate as you drift toward sleep. His brilliance is undeniable, yet it comes with profound flaws. He can outsmart the most powerful organizations in the multiverse but remains trapped by his own emotional limitations. There's something oddly comforting about this dichotomy. Even the smartest being in the universe struggles with the fundamental human condition. For all his brilliance in manipulating galactic governments, there's one system Rick Sanchez can't seem to hack: genuine human connection. What does it say about the smartest man in the universe when he'd rather face certain death as a defenseless vegetable than sit through a single hour of family therapy? The infamous Pickle Rick episode isn't just about a wacky transformation. It's a fascinating study of emotional avoidance taken to such an extreme that it reveals profound truths about intelligence and vulnerability. The episode begins with Rick announcing that he's turned himself into a pickle. This seemingly random act quickly reveals itself as an elaborate scheme to avoid attending family therapy with Beth and her children. The timing isn't coincidental. Rick has deliberately transformed himself at the exact moment they're supposed to leave for their appointment with Dr. Wong. His escape plan is nearly perfect, except for one critical detail. He's created a serum to change himself back that requires someone to administer it, and Beth, seeing through his plan, takes it with her to therapy. What follows is one of the most bizarre survival stories ever told. Rick, now stranded as a helpless pickle in his garage, must rely solely on his scientific intellect to navigate an increasingly dangerous series of environments. When rain washes him into a sewer drain, Rick begins his journey of pickle survival. Unable to move on his own, he uses his tongue to lure a cockroach, kills it with his teeth, and then manipulates the insect's nervous system to create a crude exoskeleton for mobility. This pickle adventure takes an even darker turn when Rick finds himself in a secure facility, battling against rats in an incredibly violent sequence. The methodical way Rick dispatches dozens of rats, crafting weapons from their bodies and creating increasingly sophisticated tools, showcases his remarkable adaptability. When narrated slowly as a sleep story, this frantic battle becomes almost hypnotic, the violence stripped of its intensity and transformed into a methodical exercise in problem solving. Meanwhile, at the therapy office, we witness the other half of this episode's brilliance. Dr. Wong's office becomes a stark contrast to Rick's blood-soaked adventure, a calm space where emotional truths are confronted rather than avoided. This juxtaposition creates a powerful narrative dichotomy that underscores the episode's central theme. Rick will go to literally any length, face any physical danger, to avoid psychological vulnerability. As Rick continues his escape, ascending from the sewers to a high-security black site facility, he constructs increasingly complex body attachments from the corpses of his enemies. This physical evolution mirrors the psychological journey happening in the therapy office. While Rick builds external protections for his pickle body, Dr. Wong methodically deconstructs his psychological defenses without him even being present. The therapy scenes reveal crucial dynamics in the Smith family. Beth's relationship with her father comes under particular scrutiny as Dr. Wong gently helps her recognize her enabling patterns. Beth defends Rick's absence, making excuses for his behavior while holding her children to different standards. This moment marks an important development in their relationship, as Beth begins to confront how she positions herself in relation to her father's emotional unavailability. When Rick finally arrives at the therapy session, covered in blood and riding a makeshift body constructed from rat and guard corpses, the two storylines converge in a powerful confrontation. Dr. Wong delivers one of the most incisive assessments of Rick's character ever presented in the series. She suggests that his intelligence, which allows him to escape the most impossible situations, serves primarily as a defense mechanism against confronting his emotional issues. Rick, the only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify sickness, Dr. Wong explains. You seem to alternate between viewing your own mind as an unstoppable force and as an inescapable curse. And I think it's because the only truly unapproachable concept for you is that it's your mind, within your control. This assessment strikes at the core of Rick's character, suggesting that his addiction to adventure, his constant need to prove his brilliance through increasingly dangerous scenarios, is actually a sophisticated form of avoidance. His intelligence becomes not just a tool, but a barrier that prevents emotional growth and genuine connection. The stark contrast between Rick's willingness to face death in extraordinarily violent circumstances and his unwillingness to sit through a simple therapy session reveals a profound truth. Sometimes emotional vulnerability requires more courage than physical bravery. For Rick, battling hordes of rats or government agents is preferable to looking inward at his own pain and failures. As the episode concludes, we see a rare moment of honesty from Rick as he acknowledges Dr. Wong's insights, even requesting future appointments. This brief vulnerability quickly gives way to his default cynicism, but the seed of awareness has been planted. The family leaves therapy together, with Beth showing subtle signs of recognizing her father's patterns of emotional manipulation. What makes this episode particularly soothing when narrated as a sleep story is how the frantic energy of Rick's pickle adventure transforms into a methodical problem-solving exercise. The rat combat sequence, freed from its visual intensity and described in measured tones, becomes almost meditative, a step-by-step process of adaptation and ingenuity. Similarly, the therapy scenes take on a dreamlike quality, as Dr. Wong's insights about emotional avoidance and family dynamics create a contemplative space for self-reflection. The pickle transformation itself works as a powerful symbol. Rick literally sheds his humanity to avoid confronting human emotions. His journey back to human form parallels the emotional journey he refuses to take, forcing him to rebuild himself piece by piece rather than face the more direct path of therapy. This symbolic layer adds depth to what could otherwise be dismissed as merely a wacky premise. The episode's exploration of using intelligence as a defense mechanism resonates deeply with anyone who has used their strengths to avoid confronting their weaknesses. Rick's scientific brilliance allows him to navigate the most dangerous physical environments imaginable, yet he remains trapped by his own emotional limitations. This dichotomy creates a strangely comforting narrative for bedtime contemplation, the recognition that even extraordinary abilities can't protect us from ordinary human struggles. If you think one Rick Sanchez creates problems, imagine an entire civilization of them. The Citadel isn't just a gathering place for Ricks and Mortys from across dimensions. It's a fascinating sociological experiment. What happens when thousands of identical supergeniuses with the same DNA build a society together? The answer is both surprising and disturbingly familiar. They recreate the same systemic inequalities, power structures, and corruption we see in our own world. While our main Rick and Morty are off having adventures in Atlantis, we're treated to a series of interconnected vignettes that paint a comprehensive picture of life in this rebuilt citadel. What makes these stories so captivating as bedtime contemplation is how they reveal that even when everyone starts with essentially the same genetic makeup, hierarchies inevitably form. It's nature versus nurture played out across an entire society of clones. The Factory Rick storyline gives us perhaps the most sobering view of Citadel economics. Despite being versions of the same brilliant scientist, Some Ricks are relegated to assembly line work, manufacturing the simple wafer cookies that have become a staple of Citadel cuisine. These working-class Ricks have lost the spark that makes Rick Sanchez who he is. They've been beaten down by a system designed to exploit them. When one factory Rick attempts to reclaim his dignity by creating a new recipe, he's met with indifference from management, who see the Mortys as nothing more than expendable resources. It's a stark commentary on how labor is devalued even when the laborers are technically the smartest beings in the universe. Meanwhile, at the Morty Academy, we witness the education system's role in perpetuating these class divisions. Young Mortys are taught to accept their subservient position in society, with lessons focusing on how to be better sidekicks rather than independent thinkers. When a particularly bright, tall Morty, actually a dim-witted Rick who's been held back, struggles in this environment, we see how educational institutions can fail those who don't fit the prescribed mold. Even more poignant is the Morty's teacher telling them that their dreams of adventure are statistically unlikely. Most will end up as just another cog in the Citadel's machine. This narrative thread serves as a gentle reminder of how potential can be systematically crushed by institutions meant to nurture it. The police procedural storyline introduces us to rookie cop Rick and his cynical partner, Cop Morty. Their investigation into a Morty drug ring reveals the underbelly of Citadel society: crime, corruption, and moral decay. When Cop Morty turns out to be part of the problem, taking bribes and abusing his power over other Mortys, we see how authority can corrupt even those who were once victims themselves. Rookie Rick's idealism is ultimately shattered when he realizes the depth of the system's flaws, a realization that hits particularly hard when we remember that this is a society built by versions of himself. Perhaps most fascinating is the presidential election storyline. After the destruction of the original Council of Ricks by our Rick in an earlier episode, the Citadel is holding democratic elections. The campaign features several Rick candidates spouting the same political rhetoric we're familiar with from our own world, while a single Morty candidate is treated as a joke. This Morty, however, gives an impassioned speech about unity between Ricks and Mortys that resonates with voters. His populist message of breaking down barriers between the classes seems revolutionary in a society where Mortys are systematically oppressed. When this Morty wins the election, there's a moment of hope. Perhaps things can change after all. But the episode's final revelation turns this hope to ash. The newly elected President Morty is actually evil Morty, previously seen orchestrating the deaths of multiple Ricks. In a chilling sequence, he orders the execution of Ricks who oppose his agenda, revealing that his campaign was merely a means to an end. His true motivations remain shrouded in mystery, but his ruthless efficiency suggests a deep-seated resentment toward the system that has marginalized Mortys across the multiverse. What makes this complex political thriller work as a sleep story is the way it detaches us from our own world's problems while presenting similar issues in an alien context. There's something oddly soothing about contemplating societal structures when they're populated by cartoon characters from another dimension. The problems feel both important and distant, perfect for that transitional space between wakefulness and sleep. The Citadel episode is particularly effective as a bedtime narrative because it asks profound questions without demanding immediate answers. How much of who we are is determined by our circumstances rather than our inherent nature? If thousands of identical geniuses can't create a utopia, what hope do we have with our diverse and often conflicting perspectives? These are the kinds of philosophical queries that can gently occupy your mind as consciousness begins to fade. The subtle world-building details throughout the episode create a rich tapestry for imagination. The wafer factory with its mind-numbing repetition, the shadowy alleys where Morty drug dealers peddle rainbow to help other Mortys escape their reality, the campaign headquarters where Ricks in suits strategize political victories. Each setting is distinct yet familiar, creating a dreamlike quality that's perfect for drifting off. What's particularly haunting about this episode is watching evil Morty's calculated rise to power. Unlike typical villains who announce their intentions, he works silently within the system, manipulating public sentiment and eliminating threats with surgical precision. His election represents not just a personal victory, but a fundamental shift in the power dynamic of the Citadel, A Morty is now in charge of the Ricks. This reversal creates one of the show's most significant long-term storylines, with implications that ripple throughout later seasons. Speaking of power dynamics between Ricks and Mortys, nothing demonstrates this relationship's toxicity quite like the vat of acid episode. What starts as a seemingly harmless disagreement over a fake vat of acid escalates into one of the most psychologically disturbing adventures in the series. Imagine having the power to erase every mistake with just the press of a button. It sounds like a dream, but in Rick and Morty fashion, it quickly transforms into an existential nightmare. The episode begins with Rick's ridiculous plan to escape some alien gangsters by jumping into what appears to be a vat of acid, only to reveal it's actually a cleverly disguised safe space with breathing apparatus. When the plan works flawlessly, Morty still criticizes it as stupid and unnecessarily complicated. This triggers something in Rick, that dangerous combination of genius and pettiness that drives so many of their adventures. In response to Morty's criticism, Rick creates what he calls a do-over device that allows Morty to set save points in his life and return to them whenever he wants, effectively erasing any mistakes he makes along the way. It's like having an unlimited supply of second chances, something we've all wished for at some point. But, as with everything in Rick and Morty, this power comes with hidden costs that Morty doesn't initially understand. What follows is a fascinating exploration of consequences and morality. Morty goes wild with his new power, using it for everything from minor pranks to major life decisions. We watch as he pushes an old man down the stairs, steals from a store, and even kills a man, all with the secure knowledge that he can simply press the button and erase these actions from existence. The sequence raises profound questions about whether our actions retain meaning if their consequences can be wiped away. If no one remembers the harm we cause, did we really cause harm at all? The montage sequences in this episode are particularly effective, creating a dreamlike quality that enhances the emotional impact of the story. We see Morty experience countless lives and deaths, all rendered meaningless by the press of a button. These sequences aren't just visually interesting. They invite viewers to reflect on the complexities of life and the weight of our choices in a way that feels oddly soothing when narrated slowly. The emotional core of the episode emerges when Morty meets a girl at a plane crash site. After initially using his reset button to perfect their meet-cute, he actually develops a genuine connection with her. Their relationship unfolds naturally. They travel together, fall in love, and build a life that feels real and meaningful. It's a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most profound connections in our lives develop from random chance encounters. The montage of their relationship is touching precisely because it feels authentic, not manufactured through Morty's time manipulation. But the true gut punch comes when Morty accidentally presses the reset button during a minor argument, erasing months of their relationship in an instant. His desperate attempts to recreate their perfect connection fail, because he can't manufacture the authentic circumstances that brought them together in the first place. It's a heartbreaking commentary on the fragility of human connections and the impossibility of perfectly recreating meaningful moments. The airplane sequence deserves special attention as it raises serious moral questions. To recreate the conditions of their first meeting, Morty deliberately causes a plane crash, sacrificing countless lives for his own happiness. This scene forces viewers to confront how far we might go to recapture something we've lost, and whether using others as means to our own ends can ever be justified. When narrated slowly as a sleep story, this moral dilemma becomes even more profound, a philosophical question to ponder as consciousness fades. Of course, the episode's final reveal provides the biggest shock. Rick admits that the device never actually reset time at all. Instead, it was teleporting Morty to alternate timelines where he hadn't made those mistakes, while collecting all the abandoned timelines into one reality. All those people Morty hurt, pranked, or killed? They were real, and they remember everything he did. Rick's elaborate scheme wasn't just to teach Morty a lesson. It was petty revenge for Morty criticizing his vat of acid idea. This revelation showcases the truly toxic aspects of Rick's relationship with Morty. Rick's willingness to put Morty through emotional trauma and manipulate thousands of innocent lives just to prove a point about a silly idea reveals the dangerous depths of his ego. The fact that he forces Morty to personally experience the vat of acid scenario as the final humiliation adds another layer of psychological cruelty to the punishment. What makes this episode so perfect for a sleep story is how it transforms from a sci-fi concept into a profound meditation on morality, consequences, and the authenticity of human experience. When the frantic pacing is slowed down and the philosophical questions are emphasized, it becomes a contemplative journey rather than a wacky adventure. The question of whether actions without consequences have meaning invites the kind of deep thinking that paradoxically helps the mind relax and drift towards sleep. From consequences that can be erased to a reality that's been deliberately constrained, the true nature of the Rick and Morty multiverse is about to shatter every assumption we've made about the show. While we've spent seasons wandering through seemingly infinite realities, Rick and Morty reveals that these adventures have all taken place within carefully defined boundaries, a cosmic gated community called the Central Finite Curve. The Central Finite Curve isn't just another sci-fi concept thrown around by the show. It's a revelation that recontextualizes everything we thought we knew about Rick's power. This walled-off section of the multiverse contains only realities where Rick is the smartest person alive. It's essentially a cosmic playground designed by Ricks for Ricks, ensuring that in every accessible universe, Rick's genius would never be challenged or surpassed. This revelation adds an entirely new dimension to Evil Morty's motivations. His calculated rise to power wasn't just about controlling the Citadel. It was always about escaping this artificial constraint. From his perspective, the Central Finite Curve is nothing but a system designed to keep Ricks in power while relegating all Mortys to subordinate roles. His plan to break through this barrier represents something unprecedented in the show: the first true defeat of Rick's control over the multiverse. The destruction of the Citadel unfolds like a dream sequence when narrated slowly. As Evil Morty's plan reaches its culmination, we witness the systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that has maintained Rick's dominance across realities. The golden portal that forms as Evil Morty breaks through the curve represents a visual manifestation of transcendence, escaping predetermined roles in a controlled system to access true freedom of choice. What makes this episode particularly suited for drifting off to sleep is how it balances cosmic revelations with deeply personal storytelling. While Evil Morty orchestrates his grand escape, we finally get glimpses of Rick's true backstory. Not the fabricated version he created to trick the Galactic Federation, but the authentic tragedy that shaped him. We see Rick as a family man who declined to join other Ricks in multiversal adventures, choosing instead to remain with his wife Diane and daughter Beth. This choice made him a target. When Rick Prime murdered his family, it triggered a transformation that would span decades. The episode's montage showing Rick hunting down countless versions of himself in search of his family's killer creates a haunting narrative. Each failed attempt to find Rick Prime pushed our Rick further into nihilism and alcoholism, gradually crafting the broken character we've come to know. Rick's backstory creates a perfect sleep-inducing meditation on obsession and purpose. The decades spent pursuing revenge against Rick Prime reveal a man who defined his entire existence around a single goal, only to continually face disappointment. When narrated slowly, this futile quest becomes a philosophical contemplation on whether vengeance can ever truly provide the closure we seek. The destruction of the portal fluid marks another significant shift in the show's status quo. By limiting Rick's ability to travel between dimensions, the narrative forces him to confront the consequences of his actions rather than simply abandoning problematic realities. This constraint on his freedom parallels the broader theme of the Central Finite Curve. Both represent artificial limitations that must eventually be confronted. Evil Morty's successful escape raises profound questions about determinism versus free will that are perfect for contemplating as you drift towards sleep. If the multiverse has been artificially constrained to ensure Rick's supremacy, are any choices truly free? By breaking through this barrier, Evil Morty doesn't just escape Rick's influence, he challenges the very notion that our paths are predetermined by forces beyond our control. The episode's revelations about Rick's hunt for Rick Prime add layers to his character throughout the series. His seemingly random adventures and nihilistic philosophy take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Every dimension-hopping escapade could potentially be a cover for his true mission, finding the man who destroyed his life. This recontextualization invites us to reconsider every prior episode, searching for clues we might have missed. The contrast between Rick's and Evil Morty's journeys creates a fascinating philosophical dichotomy. Rick is trapped in a cycle of vengeance, unable to move beyond his past trauma, despite having access to infinite realities. Evil Morty, meanwhile, refuses to accept the limitations imposed on him, working methodically to transcend the boundaries of the Central Finite Curve. One character is defined by his past, the other by his refusal to accept a predetermined future. When narrated as a sleep story, the existential implications of the Central Finite Curve become oddly comforting. There's something soothing about contemplating whether the limitations we perceive in our own lives are real or artificial constructs. Just as Evil Morty discovered that the seemingly infinite multiverse was actually a carefully curated selection, perhaps our own perceived limitations are more flexible than we realize. Rick's existential crisis upon realizing that achieving revenge against Rick Prime might not bring him the closure he expected parallels our own questions about purpose and meaning. What happens when we achieve our life's goal, only to find it doesn't fill the void we expected it to? This contemplative question becomes particularly poignant when considered on the edge of sleep, when our defenses are down and we're most receptive to deeper truths. Evil. Morty's rebellion against the predetermined roles within the Central Finite Curve raises questions about identity that transcend the show itself. Are we defined by the roles others expect us to play? Or can we break free from these expectations to forge our own path? His determination to escape a system designed to keep him subordinate serves as a metaphor for anyone who's ever felt constrained by society's expectations. The golden portal that Evil Morty creates serves as a perfect visual metaphor for transcendence. Unlike the familiar green portals that only allow travel within the Central Finite Curve, this golden gateway represents access to truly unlimited potential, realities where Rick isn't necessarily the smartest being. The visual distinction between these portals creates a powerful image of breaking through artificial limitations to embrace true freedom. Beyond the golden portal lies the darkest chapter of Rick's origin story, the hunt for Rick Prime. While Evil Morty made his escape to realities where Rick isn't the smartest being in the universe, our Rick remained fixated on a singular goal that had defined his existence for decades. The confrontation with Rick Prime isn't just about vengeance. It's about the emptiness that follows when your entire life has been built around a singular pursuit. In a surprising turn of events, Rick finds himself reluctantly partnering with Evil Morty to track down Rick Prime, who's been hiding within the multiverse. This uneasy alliance showcases how desperate Rick has become, willing to work with someone who represents everything he claims to despise. The hunt becomes more complicated as we learn that Rick Prime didn't just kill Diane in one reality. He's systematically erased her from every universe using the Omega device, a revelation that transforms our understanding of Rick's pain from personal tragedy to cosmic horror. This erasure explains why Rick never attempted to find a version of Diane in another reality. There are none left to find. The Omega device represents power beyond anything we've seen before, capable of not just killing but completely removing beings from existence across all realities. It's the ultimate weapon in a multiverse where death is typically just a localized inconvenience, and Rick Prime's possession of it elevates him from murderer to existential threat. As Rick gets closer to his target, the question shifts from, will he find Rick Prime? To, what happens when he does? After dedicating decades to this singular pursuit, Rick faces the possibility that revenge might not provide the closure he's been seeking. The episode brilliantly explores this philosophical dilemma. Can vengeance ever truly heal the wounds of loss, or does it simply leave a different kind of emptiness in its wake? The tension builds as Rick Prime realizes he's being hunted, leading to a game of interdimensional cat and mouse that showcases both Rick's genius. Meanwhile, Evil Morty's involvement reveals his own agenda. He's not helping Rick out of altruism, but to position himself to seize the Omega device. Throughout their uneasy partnership, Evil Morty demonstrates intellectual capabilities that surpass both Ricks, manipulating events to ensure his own success regardless of the outcome of their confrontation. When Rick finally comes face to face with Rick Prime, the moment carries the weight of countless realities and decades of pursuit. Their confrontation is less a battle of fists and more a collision of philosophies, with Rick Prime representing an unrepentant version of Rick himself, someone who views family as a limitation rather than a strength. The parallel forces Rick to confront uncomfortable truths about his own nature and how similar he might have become to the man he hates. The actual defeat of Rick Prime provides a moment of catharsis for Rick, but what follows is perhaps more significant. Instead of satisfaction, Rick experiences an existential crisis. After achieving the goal that defined his existence for so long, he's left with the question that haunts many who achieve vengeance. Now what? The emptiness that follows suggests that revenge is ultimately hollow, unable to fill the void left by loss or truly reverse the damage done. This realization marks a potential turning point for Rick's character. Without his quest for vengeance to drive him, he must confront who he is beyond that singular purpose. It's a moment that could lead to genuine growth or could plunge him deeper into nihilism without the structure of his revenge quest to guide him. Meanwhile, evil Morty emerges as the true victor of this confrontation, seizing control of the Omega device while Rick is distracted by his emotional confrontation with Rick Prime. This acquisition establishes evil Morty as perhaps the most dangerous entity in the multiverse, a being with both the intelligence to outmaneuver Rick and now the power to erase entire existences across all realities. His ascension represents a shift in the show's power dynamics, suggesting that the student has finally surpassed the master in every meaningful way. The episode's exploration of revenge's emptiness provides a surprisingly soothing backdrop for contemplation as we drift towards sleep. There's something universally relatable about the discovery that achieving our most desired goal might not bring the satisfaction we expected. It invites us to consider our own fixations and whether they truly serve our well-being or simply distract us from confronting deeper emotional truths. Rick's journey becomes a meditation on letting go, not just of vengeance, but of defining ourselves through our traumas. The realization that revenge cannot heal his wounds forces Rick to face the possibility that nothing can truly erase his pain, and that perhaps learning to live with it is the only path forward. This acceptance, though difficult, represents a more authentic form of closure than any act of vengeance could provide. The cosmic scale of Rick's revenge quest, when narrated slowly, transforms from a high-stakes adventure into a philosophical exploration of purpose and identity. We see in Rick's empty victory a reflection of our own tendency to believe that achieving some external goal will finally bring us peace, when true peace might only come from within. The void inside often proves scarier than any monsters we face in the outside world. When Rick and Morty stumble upon a mysterious hole in Fear No More, what begins as yet another bizarre adventure transforms into one of the most profound explorations of insecurity the show has ever delivered. This strange hole doesn't just trap people physically, it forces them to confront their deepest, most primal fears before allowing escape. Unlike typical monsters or aliens with tentacles and teeth, this psychological prison tailors itself perfectly to each victim's subconscious. It's the ultimate mirror, reflecting back not what we claim to fear, but what truly terrifies us at our core. When Morty falls into the hole, something unexpected happens. While Rick believes he's jumped in after his grandson to rescue him, the truth is more complicated. Rick never entered the hole at all, only Morty did. And what materializes as Morty's greatest fear? Not death, not physical danger, but something far more emotionally devastating. A vision of Rick reuniting with his deceased wife, Diane. The vision crafted by Morty's subconscious reveals his most profound anxiety. That despite all their adventures together, despite all they've shared, he might be nothing more than a temporary companion in Rick's life. Someone who could be readily abandoned if Rick ever found a way to return to his original family. The hole exposes Morty's fear that the relationship isn't equal, that he cares more about Rick than Rick cares about him. What makes this psychological exploration so compelling is how it forces Morty to work through these anxieties. The hole creates an elaborate illusion where every time Morty thinks he's escaped, he finds himself trapped in another layer of his fear. These false exits create a dreamlike structure where reality keeps shifting, making it impossible to distinguish truth from fabrication, much like our own spiraling anxieties when we lie awake at night. Within these layered illusions, we see Rick and Diane enjoying their time together, highlighting a gentler, more vulnerable version of Rick. Their date sequence offers a rare glimpse into what Rick might have been like before tragedy rewrote his story. Diane isn't just a character in this scenario. She represents everything Morty feels he can't compete with. An irreplaceable piece of Rick's past that leaves Morty feeling like a poor substitute. This manifestation of Diane through Morty's subconscious reveals something profound about Morty's perception of his place in Rick's world. Despite never having met Diane, Morty has constructed a version of her based on fragments of information he's gathered about Rick's past. His subconscious casts her as someone vibrant, loving, and capable of connecting with Rick in ways Morty fears he never can. In Morty's mind, Diane represents not just Rick's lost love, but the idea that Morty himself might be merely a replaceable piece in Rick's vast, complicated life. The genius of this episode lies in how it transforms Morty's fear into a catalyst for growth. As he navigates deeper into the Hole's illusions, Morty begins to understand that his anxiety isn't just about Rick's past. It's about his own sense of worth. The Hole forces him to confront whether his relationship with Rick has actual significance, or if he's merely a convenient sidekick. Throughout the series, we've watched Morty evolve from a terrified, stuttering teen into someone more confident and assertive. This episode marks a significant milestone in that journey, as Morty finally acknowledges his deepest insecurity: the fear that the relationship that has come to define his life might be fundamentally unbalanced. What makes this exploration particularly poignant is how universal it feels. The fear that we care more about someone than they care about us resonates across all kinds of relationships. Parents worry their children don't need them anymore. Friends wonder if they're the only ones making an effort. Romantic partners question if their love is being equally returned. By framing Morty's fear in these terms, the episode transforms a sci-fi concept into a deeply human story about vulnerability and connection. The Hole's psychological mechanisms serve as a perfect metaphor for how anxiety operates, creating false scenarios, making us question reality, and trapping us in cycles of doubt that seem impossible to escape. Each false exit Morty encounters parallels how our minds create temporary reprieves from our deepest fears, only to plunge us back into anxiety when we least expect it. When Morty finally manages to break free from the Hole, having confronted his fears directly, he emerges changed. He's faced the possibility that he might love Rick more than Rick loves him, and survived that confrontation. This represents significant emotional growth for Morty, who has spent much of the series desperately seeking Rick's approval and attention. The episode's most touching moment comes at the end, when Rick opts not to jump into the Hole himself. Instead of following Morty's path of psychological confrontation, Rick chooses to honor Morty's accomplishment by keeping a photo of him. This small but significant gesture shows Rick's own growth, an acknowledgement of Morty's importance that speaks volumes more than any grandstanding rescue attempt could have. The contrast between Rick's earlier vengeful quest and this quiet display of affection highlights how far their relationship has evolved. Rick's decision not to enter the Hole suggests he might be afraid of what he'd find there. Perhaps his own fears mirror Morty's in ways he's not ready to face. Or perhaps, more optimistically, he's finally learning to respect Morty as an individual capable of overcoming his own challenges. What makes Rick Sanchez so fascinating isn't just his scientific genius, but the philosophical foundation that drives him. Throughout the early seasons, Rick repeatedly hammers home his belief that nothing in the universe has inherent meaning, a stance that initially appears to be just another aspect of his abrasive personality. But what if this nihilistic worldview isn't merely a defense mechanism or character quirk? What if it's actually the cornerstone of everything Rick does? In the first 2 seasons, we witness Rick fully embracing what philosophers would call cosmic nihilism. It's not just that Rick feels disconnected from normal human concerns, he actively rejects the very idea that anything should matter at all. The universe, according to Rick, is a chaotic, random system without purpose or plan. This isn't a passing mood for Rick. It's a deeply held conviction that shapes his interactions with everyone around him. The episode Rick Potion Number 9 offers perhaps the most striking demonstration of this philosophy in action. After Rick and Morty accidentally transform the entire population of Earth into horrific mutants, Rick's solution isn't to fix their mistake. It's to simply abandon ship. He casually locates an alternate timeline where versions of themselves conveniently die, allows Morty to bury his own corpse, and then continues as if nothing happened. For most people, destroying an entire world and abandoning your original universe would be traumatic and morally devastating. For Rick, it's Tuesday. This cavalier attitude toward reality itself speaks to how thoroughly Rick has internalized the idea that nothing matters. If there are infinite universes with infinite possibilities, then what significance does any single timeline hold? Why get attached to any particular version of reality? This cosmic perspective allows Rick to treat existence itself as disposable, a luxury only possible when you've completely rejected the notion that anything has inherent value. But Rick's nihilism isn't just philosophical posturing. It's etched into his very language. His catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," initially comes across as nonsensical party gibberish, the kind of thing you'd expect from a zany, carefree scientist. But in a revealing moment, Bird Person translates this phrase and exposes its true meaning: "I am in great pain." This hidden cry for help embedded in Rick's most recognizable utterance suggests something crucial about his nihilism. It's not just a philosophical position, but a response to profound suffering. This revelation forces us to reconsider Rick's substance abuse, which permeates nearly every episode. The ever-present flask, the frequent intoxication, the casual drug use. These aren't just character traits played for laughs. They represent Rick's ongoing attempt to numb himself to the existential awareness that torments him. If you genuinely believe the universe is meaningless and random, yet you're conscious enough to understand the implications of that belief, wouldn't you also seek ways to dull that painful awareness? The irony of Rick's character becomes even more apparent when we examine his relationship with science. While he uses his scientific genius to repeatedly prove the meaninglessness of existence, showing Morty how insignificant Earth is in. The cosmic scale, demonstrating the arbitrary nature of life and death through his technology, Rick simultaneously uses that same science to maintain absolute control over his environment. He creates devices that can freeze time, alter memories, transport between dimensions, and even resurrect the dead. For someone who insists nothing matters, Rick works remarkably hard to bend reality to his will. This contradiction reveals something deeper about Rick's nihilism. It's not just a philosophical conclusion he's reached through rational analysis. It's also a shield, a coping mechanism that protects him from vulnerability. By insisting nothing matters, Rick gives himself permission to avoid emotional connections, dodge responsibility, and escape the pain of loss. It's easier to believe everything is meaningless than to admit you care and risk getting hurt. What makes this especially intriguing is how often Rick's actions betray his stated beliefs. Despite his verbal dismissal of meaning and attachment, we occasionally glimpse moments where Rick shows genuine concern for others, particularly Morty and his family. These contradictions suggest that beneath Rick's hardened, nihilistic exterior lies a person still capable of forming attachments, someone who hasn't completely severed his connection to humanity. This tension between Rick's proclaimed philosophy and his occasional acts of compassion raises an important question. What experiences shaped this worldview? What could transform someone into a person who rejects meaning so thoroughly while simultaneously fighting so hard to survive? The show hints at traumatic events in Rick's past, losses, betrayals, and failures that might have driven him to embrace nihilism as a form of self-protection. When the pain of caring becomes too great, declaring that nothing matters provides convenient emotional insulation. Rick's nihilism serves dual purposes. It's both an intellectual framework through which he understands the universe and an emotional defense that shields him from pain. By rejecting meaning, Rick gives himself license to act however he wants without moral constraints. By denying the importance of connections, he protects himself from the vulnerability that comes with caring about others. It's a comprehensive system that allows Rick to function in a universe he finds unbearable. The paradox at the heart of Rick's character is that despite his insistence that nothing matters, He continues to pursue his own desires with relentless determination. He battles galactic federations, outsmarts cosmic entities, and manipulates timelines, all while claiming none of it has any significance. This contradiction suggests that Rick hasn't truly embraced nihilism in its purest form. Instead, he's adopted a selective nihilism that conveniently applies to things he wants to avoid while exempting the things he wants to pursue. Understanding Rick's nihilistic foundation doesn't just illuminate his character. It invites us to confront uncomfortable philosophical questions ourselves. If the universe truly is random and meaningless, as Rick suggests, how should we respond? Should we, like Rick, use that realization as justification for selfish behavior? Or is there another way to acknowledge cosmic insignificance while still creating personal meaning? For someone who claims nothing matters in an infinite universe, Rick Sanchez has gone to extraordinary lengths to isolate himself in a carefully curated section of reality. This contradiction reveals Rick's most carefully guarded secret. His nihilism isn't universal, it's deeply personal and selective. The Central Finite Curve represents far more than just a scientific concept. It's a prison that Rick himself helped create, ensuring he only encounters realities where he remains the smartest being in the universe. This elaborate multiversal barrier reveals how desperately Rick needs to maintain the illusion of his uniqueness and superiority. When we examine the Central Finite Curve more closely, we begin to understand a fundamental contradiction in Rick's character. He's effectively divided the multiverse into two halves, one where he reigns supreme intellectually and another where he doesn't. For a man who repeatedly insists that nothing has meaning in an infinite cosmos, he's invested considerable effort into controlling which parts of infinity he can access. The curved section of reality he travels within isn't random. It's deliberately engineered to protect his ego and worldview. This control mechanism becomes even more fascinating when we observe Rick's interactions with his alternate selves. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, we witness C-137 Rick's undisguised contempt for the Council of Ricks. When confronted with this governing body of alternate versions of himself, Rick doesn't respond with the casual indifference his nihilism would suggest. Instead, he expresses outright disdain, declaring them beneath him. Each encounter with another Rick forces our Rick to acknowledge that he isn't as unique as he pretends to be. He's just one variation among countless others, each making different choices. Rick's hatred for his alternate selves runs remarkably deep. Rather than viewing them with detached amusement, as his nihilistic philosophy might suggest, he treats them as personal affronts to his existence. This intense emotional reaction betrays something profound about Rick's character, a deep-seated self-loathing that manifests in his inability to accept his own choices when mirrored in other versions of himself. Each alternate Rick represents a path not taken, a decision point where reality branched, and these reminders appear to cause Rick genuine psychological distress. The Council of Ricks serves as perhaps the most direct challenge to Rick C-137's perception of himself. These Ricks chose cooperation and organization. They formed a government, established protocols, and created a society. Their very existence demonstrates that Rick's antisocial, boundary-pushing personality isn't an inevitable result of his genius, but simply one possible expression of it. Other Ricks found ways to work together, suggesting Rick C-137's isolation is a choice rather than a necessity. This realization undermines the deterministic aspects of Rick's nihilism. If other versions of himself made different choices, his own path can't be inevitable or meaningless. The multiverse creates a uniquely complex philosophical problem for Rick. On one hand, infinite realities seem to support his nihilistic stance. If every possible outcome exists somewhere, then no single choice has ultimate significance. When Rick casually abandons timelines or replaces versions of himself, he's acting consistently with someone who believes individual choices don't matter in an infinite cosmos. Yet paradoxically, the multiverse simultaneously presents the most devastating challenge to his worldview by showing him versions of himself who found happiness, meaning, or different values despite sharing his intellect and experiences. The existence of infinite timelines forces Rick to confront a painful truth. If nothing truly matters, why does he care so intensely about maintaining his position as the superior Rick? His elaborate efforts to remain within the Central Finite Curve reveal that he does believe some things matter very much, specifically his status and self-image. The multiverse doesn't just challenge Rick's control. It forces him to face the roads not taken and the versions of himself who made choices he can't accept. This tension becomes most apparent when Rick encounters versions of himself who have found genuine connections or happiness. While Rick C-137 maintains that emotional attachments are meaningless chemical reactions, the existence of Ricks who have embraced family, love, or even simple contentment challenges this assertion. If these alternate Ricks can find meaning despite sharing his genius and awareness of the multiverse, it suggests Rick C-137's nihilism might be less a philosophical truth and more a personal defense mechanism. Evil Morty's plan to escape the Central Finite Curve adds another fascinating dimension to this dynamic. By viewing the curve as a prison designed to keep Mortys subservient to Rick's, Evil Morty directly challenges the control Rick has established over reality itself. His goal to find a universe without Rick's influence represents the ultimate rebellion against Rick's carefully constructed worldview, seeking a reality where Rick isn't the smartest or most dominant being. This quest highlights how the Central Finite Curve doesn't just protect Rick's ego, it maintains an entire power structure that benefits him. As Rick travels the multiverse, he's consistently confronted with evidence that undermines his nihilistic shield. While he publicly maintains that nothing matters, his actions reveal something quite different. He goes to extraordinary lengths to maintain his position, control his environment, and avoid universes where he might not be superior. The Central Finite Curve doesn't just protect Rick from external threats. It protects him from having to confront the possibility that his entire philosophical framework might be built on self-deception. The creator commentary on the show suggests this tension is intentional. The multiverse serves as a storytelling device that allows for exploration of different character arcs and moral dilemmas. Through Rick's various encounters with alternate versions of himself, the show examines how the existence of infinite timelines both supports and challenges Rick's nihilistic stance. While infinite possibilities might seem to dilute the meaning of any single choice, they also demonstrate that different choices lead to genuinely different outcomes and experiences, some potentially more fulfilling than others. While the multiverse offers Rick infinite possibilities, it can't provide him with infinite life. Despite his claims that existence is meaningless, Rick's relationship with death reveals perhaps his most profound contradiction. The elaborate measures of a man terrified of an ending he pretends not to fear. Throughout the series, we witness a character who discusses mortality with casual indifference while simultaneously maintaining intricate safeguards against his own demise. Rick's approach to death follows a fascinating pattern: philosophical dismissal paired with practical obsession. He's constructed an entire infrastructure dedicated to his continued existence, from clone bodies to consciousness transfers. These aren't just casual precautions, but meticulously designed systems that allow him to cheat death repeatedly. When we examine these elaborate contingency plans closely, they reveal something crucial about Rick's character. For someone who insists that nothing matters in an infinite universe, he invests extraordinary resources into ensuring his own survival. What makes this contradiction even more compelling is how it manifests in Rick's darkest moments. In autoerotic assimilation, we see Rick at his most vulnerable following Unity's departure. The episode's final sequence shows him returning home alone, emotionally devastated after being abandoned by the hive mind he'd formed an intimate connection with. Without speaking a word, Rick wordlessly assembles a death ray, melts a small creature in front of himself as a test, and then positions himself to follow suit, only to pass out before completing the attempt. This haunting moment strips away his carefully constructed facade, revealing the raw pain he typically conceals beneath layers of cynicism and intellectual superiority. The suicide attempt scene is particularly revealing because it occurs immediately after Unity rejects him. This timing suggests that Rick's nihilism isn't just a philosophical position but a defense mechanism against emotional pain. When that defense fails, when someone he cares about leaves him, we see that his claims about life's meaninglessness ring hollow. If existence truly meant nothing to Rick, Unity's departure wouldn't have pushed him to such extremes. His reaction exposes the truth. Connections matter deeply to him, despite his insistence to the contrary. Rick's fear of death is intertwined with his fear of meaninglessness in ways that create the central tension of his character. If nothing truly matters in an infinite cosmos, why fight so desperately to stay alive? Why create backup plans for your backup plans? The answer seems to be that Rick's nihilism is incomplete, a partial truth he clings to rather than a conviction he fully embodies. His actions repeatedly contradict his stated philosophy, especially regarding his own mortality. The Pickle Rick episode serves as a perfect metaphor for this contradiction. By transforming himself into a pickle specifically to avoid family therapy, Rick demonstrates the extraordinary lengths he'll go to escape emotional confrontation. What begins as avoidance quickly transforms into a life-or-death struggle, as Pickle Rick fashions weapons from rat parts and battles through a secure facility. The episode functions as an extended metaphor for how Rick approaches emotional vulnerability. He'd rather face death in increasingly absurd scenarios than confront the psychological realities that therapy might reveal. Rick's interactions with characters who represent mortality further highlight his complicated relationship with death. Unity, for instance, represents a form of immortality through assimilation, a collective consciousness that never truly dies as individuals might. Rick's attraction to Unity suggests his interest in forms of existence that transcend ordinary human limitations, including the limitation of death. Their relationship allows him to temporarily escape his mortality by merging with something greater than himself, making their separation all the more devastating. Throughout the series, Rick employs humor and nihilism as shields against his fear of meaninglessness. His frequent jokes about death and destruction create distance between himself and the emotional reality of mortality. By treating death as a punchline, he attempts to strip it of its power. But this approach fails during moments of genuine emotional connection and loss, as we see in the aftermath of Unity's departure. When the shields come down, Rick's fear of death, and his deeper fear that his life lacks meaning, becomes painfully apparent. What makes this contradiction particularly compelling is that Rick seems at least partially aware of it. His intelligence allows him to recognize the inconsistency between his philosophical claims and his actions, yet he continues to maintain both simultaneously. This self-awareness adds layers to his character, suggesting that his nihilism isn't simply a misconception, but a chosen strategy for navigating an existence he finds painful. The most telling evidence of Rick's complicated relationship with death comes from examining how he approaches the mortality of others versus his own. While he can casually disintegrate attackers or abandon entire timelines to their fate, he approaches his own potential demise with meticulous planning and desperate avoidance. This double standard reveals that Rick's nihilism is selective. It applies to everything and everyone except himself and those few individuals he truly cares about. For all his intellect, Rick's fear of death ultimately makes him profoundly human. His elaborate defenses against mortality aren't just scientific achievements, but emotional barriers against the universal human fear of ending. Even with access to infinite timelines and realities, Rick cannot escape the fundamental truth that his individual consciousness, the specific awareness that makes him who he is, remains vulnerable to termination. His contingency plans aren't just about physical survival, but about preserving his unique perspective and experiences. Despite Rick's claims that nothing matters in the grand cosmic scheme, there's one relationship that subtly yet profoundly challenges this philosophy: his bond with Morty. While it might seem that Morty's purpose is merely practical, providing brainwave camouflage to hide Rick from his enemies, the evolution of their relationship suggests something far more significant is happening beneath the surface. Rick's relationship with his grandson begins purely as a utilitarian arrangement. In early episodes, Morty functions primarily as what Rick calls brainwave camouflage, a convenient genetic shield whose brainwaves cancel out Rick's genius patterns, making him invisible to various threats. Rick treats Morty as disposable, dragging him on dangerous adventures with little regard for his safety or emotional well-being. He's simply a tool in Rick's vast scientific toolkit, seemingly unimportant beyond his practical function. But as their adventures continue, something unexpected happens. Rick begins displaying behaviors that contradict his stated philosophy. We witness moments where Rick actively defends Morty against external threats, often putting himself at risk in the process. These protective impulses emerge with increasing frequency across the seasons, revealing a genuine, if reluctant, attachment forming between grandfather and grandson. The gradual transformation in how Rick treats Morty becomes one of the show's most compelling character arcs. What begins as dismissive tolerance evolves into something resembling actual care. Rick's occasional protection of Morty shifts from being calculated and self-serving to instinctive and genuinely concerned. These aren't the actions of someone who truly believes nothing matters. They're the actions of someone who has found something that does. This evolution becomes particularly evident in episodes where Rick prioritizes Morty's well-being over scientific advancement or even his own safety. These choices represent significant contradictions to Rick's nihilistic worldview. If nothing truly matters in an infinite universe, why would Rick sacrifice potential discoveries or put himself at risk for a teenager he claims to find annoying? The answer seems to be that, despite his protests, Morty has become important to Rick in ways that challenge his fundamental philosophy. The revelation of Rick's backstory in Rick Mirai Jack adds crucial context to this relationship. Learning about Rick's original family and the trauma of losing his Beth provides deeper insight into his connection with Morty. These aren't just random adventures with a convenient sidekick. They're a complex emotional journey for a man who lost his family and is now forming a bond with an alternate version of his grandson. The fact that Rick chooses to stay with this particular Morty, despite having access to infinite versions across the multiverse, speaks volumes about the significance of their specific relationship. In the Vat of Acid episode, we see a particularly fascinating dimension of their dynamic. Rick goes to extreme lengths to teach Morty a lesson about respecting him, creating an elaborate scenario involving a fake time travel device that actually just shifts Morty between parallel dimensions. The complexity of this scheme reveals something important. Rick cares deeply about Morty's perception of him. For someone who claims nothing matters, Rick invests considerable effort in maintaining his status in Morty's eyes. This contradiction exposes the cracks in Rick's nihilistic armor. What makes Morty such a powerful counterforce to Rick's nihilism is their fundamental philosophical difference. While Rick approached the universe's vastness and concluded nothing matters, Morty consistently demonstrates a stubborn belief that things do matter, especially people, relationships, and moral choices. Morty's persistent optimism and moral center serve as a direct challenge to Rick's cosmic cynicism. He insists on seeing meaning where Rick sees only chaos, finding value in experiences Rick dismisses as pointless. The beauty of their relationship lies in this philosophical tension. Morty doesn't defeat Rick's nihilism through argument or evidence. He erodes it through consistent presence and unwavering humanity. Every time Morty shows compassion in situations where Rick would be callous, every moment Morty finds joy in experiences Rick considers banal, he's quietly challenging Rick's worldview. This persistent contrast forces Rick to confront the possibility that nihilism isn't the only rational response to an infinite universe. Creator commentary supports this interpretation, suggesting that Morty serves as a deliberate counterbalance to Rick's extreme perspectives. Morty's influence gradually pulls Rick away from complete nihilistic surrender, providing an emotional anchor that Rick would never admit he needs. The relationship functions as a philosophical life raft, keeping Rick from drowning entirely in his own bleak worldview. Rick's growing protectiveness of Morty represents more than just character development. It signals his gradual reconnection with humanity. After isolating himself in scientific pursuits and cosmic adventures, Rick finds himself forming an attachment that contradicts his stated beliefs. This connection becomes the first significant crack in his nihilistic armor, a vulnerability he both resents and needs. What's particularly compelling is how Rick's defense mechanisms evolve around this relationship. Rather than abandoning his nihilistic stance entirely, Rick develops elaborate justifications for his attachment to Morty. He'll claim it's merely for practical purposes, or dismiss his protective actions as self-interest. These rationalizations reveal Rick's struggle to reconcile his growing care for Morty with his established worldview, a philosophical crisis he refuses to acknowledge directly. In episodes where Rick defends Morty against threats or prioritizes Morty's well-being over scientific advancement, we're seeing more than just character growth. We're witnessing a fundamental philosophical shift happening beneath the surface of Rick's consciousness. Morty becomes living proof that Rick's nihilism isn't as absolute as he claims, that even in an infinite universe of meaningless chaos, specific connections can still matter profoundly. The Vat of Acid episode exemplifies this contradiction perfectly. Rick's elaborate scheme to teach Morty a lesson about respect reveals both his pettiness and his deep-seated need for Morty's approval. The extreme measures Rick takes wouldn't make sense if Morty truly meant nothing to him. This episode showcases the paradox at the heart of their relationship. Rick needs to maintain his nihilistic persona while simultaneously caring deeply about Morty's perception of him. What emerges from their relationship is a profound challenge to Rick's nihilistic foundation. If nothing truly matters in an infinite universe, why does this particular grandson matter so much? Why does Rick consistently choose this specific Morty's company when he could access infinite versions? Why protect him, teach him, or care about his opinion? The answer seems to be that Morty has become the exception to Rick's rule, the first crack in his nihilistic armor that creates space for meaning to enter. Morty isn't the only contradiction in Rick's emotional landscape. For a man who dismisses love as a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed, Rick sure spends a lot of time forming attachments that make absolutely no scientific sense in his worldview. His cynical exterior might convince casual observers, but when we look closer at his relationships, we see a man whose actions consistently betray his nihilistic philosophy. The deeper connections he forms throughout the series reveal something far more complicated than the uncaring scientist he pretends to be. Rick's relationship with Unity represents perhaps the most glaring contradiction to his stated beliefs about love. In autoerotic assimilation, we witness a romance between Rick and a collective hive mind that controls entire civilizations. Their reunion initially seems like just another of Rick's hedonistic adventures, manipulating Unity to create his ideal party scenario and indulge his every desire. But as the episode progresses, we see something much deeper emerge. When Unity ultimately leaves Rick, his reaction goes far beyond mere disappointment at losing a good time. The aftermath of Unity's departure shows a side of Rick we rarely see. This supposedly emotionless scientist who claims to understand the meaningless chemical nature of love completely falls apart. In one of the series' darkest moments, Rick returns to his garage, seemingly intending to end his life following Unity's rejection. This suicidal response makes absolutely no sense within Rick's stated worldview. If love is just chemicals designed to ensure reproduction as he claims, why would its absence drive him to such despair? The answer seems obvious. Rick's philosophical stance is a shield, protecting a heart far more vulnerable than he would ever admit. Rick's decades-long friendship with Bird Person offers another window into his emotional contradictions. Their relationship spans what appears to be a revolutionary past, fighting side by side and developing the kind of bond that typically exists only between people who have faced death together. Despite Rick's usual self-centered behavior, he maintains this connection across years, dimensions, and even betrayal. When Bird Person is nearly killed, Rick goes to extraordinary lengths to save him, actions that would be pointless in a truly meaningless universe where attachments don't matter. In A Wrinkle in Time, we see perhaps the most direct contradiction of Rick's nihilistic stance when he willingly sacrifices himself to save Morty and Summer. In a moment of split-time crisis, Rick gives up his device that would save him, choosing instead to ensure his grandchildren's safety. For someone who claims nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, this selfless act reveals the lie at the heart of his philosophy. Why save these particular versions of Morty and Summer when infinite others exist? The answer is simple: because these specific individuals matter to Rick in ways he can't reconcile with his stated beliefs. The Ricklantis mix-up gives us a fascinating glimpse into other versions of Rick who have formed various kinds of emotional bonds. The episode presents us with Ricks who care for their Mortys in ways our Rick typically avoids showing. Some Ricks have formed friendships with other Ricks, families with other Mortys, and even romantic relationships. All variations that suggest Rick's capacity for connection isn't just a fluke in our main timeline, but a fundamental aspect of his character across the multiverse. What makes Rick's emotional contradictions so fascinating is how desperately he tries to deny them. His reluctance to admit love clearly stems from a profound fear of vulnerability. Rick has experienced significant loss in his life, and opening himself to connection means opening himself to the pain that inevitably comes with it. We see this fear manifest in how he pushes people away despite his obvious need for connection. His caustic behavior, constant belittling of others, and frequent abandonment of relationships all serve as preemptive strikes against the potential pain of loss. The philosophical tension created by Rick's simultaneous rejection and pursuit of meaningful connections defines his character more than perhaps any other trait. On one hand, he clings to the idea that nothing matters in an infinite universe where every possibility exists somewhere. On the other hand, he consistently demonstrates that specific people in specific timelines matter enormously to him. He might verbally dismiss the importance of love and connection, but his actions reveal a man desperately trying to reconcile his intellectual nihilism with his emotional reality. What we're really witnessing is Rick's struggle with the fundamental human condition. In a universe that offers no inherent meaning, humans create meaning through connection. Rick's scientific genius allows him to see the underlying mechanisms of reality more clearly than most. The arbitrary nature of existence, the endless variations of every possibility, the ultimate cosmic indifference. Yet despite this knowledge, he still can't escape the fundamentally human need to form bonds that matter. The greatest irony of Rick's character may be that his genius enables him to understand the meaninglessness of the universe, while simultaneously making him more susceptible to the pain this knowledge brings. Unlike most people who can comfortably exist in the illusion of cosmic significance, Rick sees through the facade. Yet his emotional attachments persist despite this knowledge, creating an internal conflict he medicates with alcohol, adventures, and scientific distraction. Even more fascinating is how Rick's emotional connections have begun to influence his worldview rather than the other way around. While he verbally maintains his nihilistic stance, his actions increasingly suggest a man whose experiences of connection are gradually reshaping his philosophy. Each relationship, with Unity, with Bird Person, with Morty, leaves a mark that slowly erodes his commitment to meaninglessness. The question becomes not whether Rick's nihilism can survive his capacity for love, but whether Rick can continue to deny the meaning these connections create in his life. Those connections with Unity and Bird Person reveal Rick's capacity for deep bonds, but there's one relationship that stands at the center of his emotional universe, whether he admits it or not. For all his dimensional hopping and galaxy-spanning adventures, Rick's greatest journey might be the one taking place right under the Smith family roof, his gradual, reluctant return to being a father. When Rick first reappeared in Beth's life after decades of absence, he maintained a carefully cultivated emotional distance. His early interactions with Beth were characterized by dismissiveness, treating family connections as inconvenient attachments that might slow down his scientific pursuits. Beth, desperate for her father's approval, initially accepted this arrangement without question. But what began as a convenient place to crash has evolved into something far more meaningful, creating the most fascinating contradiction in Rick's character. Think about it. This is a man who can create and destroy entire universes, yet he seems utterly terrified of disappointing his daughter. We see this fear manifest in subtle ways, like when he tries to impress her with his scientific achievements or how he occasionally softens his typically harsh demeanor around her. Despite his claims that family ties are meaningless constructs in an infinite multiverse, Rick's actions reveal that Beth's opinion of him matters deeply. The ABCs of Beth stands as one of the most revealing episodes about their relationship. Here, Rick confronts something far more terrifying than any alien monster: the realization that Beth inherited his darkest traits. The episode forces Rick to see himself reflected in his daughter, creating a mirror that reveals his own flaws and the implications of his parenting choices. Their shared intelligence, ruthless problem-solving, and capacity for violence create an uncomfortable reflection that Rick can't easily dismiss. What makes their dynamic so fascinating is how Rick struggles with opposing desires, wanting to maintain emotional distance while simultaneously seeking Beth's approval. This tension creates moments where his carefully constructed walls briefly crumble, revealing glimpses of genuine care beneath his cynical exterior. These aren't grand gestures, but subtle shifts in his behavior that speak volumes about his inner conflict. The introduction of Space Beth takes this complexity to an entirely new level. When Rick offered Beth the choice between staying with her family or exploring the cosmos with a clone taking her place, he wasn't just providing options. He was attempting to give Beth something he never allowed himself: freedom without consequences. By creating a scenario where Beth could pursue her desires without abandoning her family obligations, Rick revealed a deep understanding of the pain caused by his own abandonment. Space. Beth represents Rick's attempt at atonement, a way to prevent his daughter from repeating his mistakes without directly acknowledging his regret. What's particularly telling is how Rick refuses to reveal which Beth is the clone, treating both as equally valid. This decision stands in stark contrast to his usual hierarchical view of the multiverse, where he categorizes realities and beings according to their usefulness or relevance. With both Beths, Rick demonstrates an uncharacteristic commitment to a quality that suggests profound personal growth. Rick's relationship with Jerry presents another fascinating layer to his family dynamics. On the surface, Rick relentlessly mocks and belittles his son-in-law, treating him as the embodiment of mediocrity. Yet beneath this constant ridicule, we see moments where Rick displays a grudging tolerance and even occasional respect for Jerry. These moments usually occur when Jerry demonstrates unexpected courage, or when Rick recognizes that Jerry's presence is important to Beth's happiness. The evolution of this relationship suggests that Rick's integration into the Smith family is changing him in ways he actively resists. Each family dinner, each shared adventure, each moment of forced cooperation with Jerry slowly chips away at Rick's emotional walls. He maintains his cynical exterior, but his actions increasingly contradict his professed indifference to family bonds. What's particularly fascinating is how Rick's attitude toward family responsibility has shifted over time. In early seasons, he viewed family obligations as burdensome restrictions on his freedom. Yet as the series progresses, we see him gradually accepting certain responsibilities, whether it's attending family functions, protecting the Smiths from the consequences of his scientific experiments, or even making occasional sacrifices for their well-being. These aren't dramatic transformations, but subtle adjustments that reveal a man slowly, reluctantly reconnecting with the concept of belonging. This gradual shift creates the most compelling question about Rick's character. Is family connection undermining his nihilism? For someone who insists nothing matters in an infinite multiverse, Rick invests considerable energy in maintaining his relationship with this specific family in this specific reality. He could easily abandon them for another identical family in another dimension, yet he stays, suggesting these particular connections hold meaning beyond what his philosophy should allow. The Smith household has become the one laboratory where Rick Sanchez has no control over the variables. While he can predict the behavior of complex cosmic entities and manipulate the laws of physics, he cannot fully dictate the terms of his relationships with Beth, Morty, Summer, or even Jerry. These connections operate according to emotional rules that defy his scientific approach to existence, creating unpredictable outcomes that both frustrate and fascinate him. What emerges from this family dynamic is a man caught between his intellectual commitment to meaninglessness and his emotional experience of connection. Rick can verbally maintain that family bonds are arbitrary biological attachments without significance, but his actions tell a different story. One of a man who finds himself reluctantly anchored to meaning through the very familial connections he claims to dismiss. Despite all his extraordinary adventures across dimensions, Rick's most significant journey might be the ordinary human experience of reconnecting with family after prolonged absence. This journey lacks the spectacle of his sci-fi exploits, but contains far greater emotional depth. It's the story of a man who believed he could escape the messy complications of family, only to find himself drawn back into its orbit by forces more powerful than even his genius can resist. Beyond the walls of the Smith household, Rick faces entities that challenge his autonomy in ways far more direct than family obligations ever could. When Rick created an entire civilization inside a battery to power his car, he wasn't just being practical, he was playing God himself. This contradiction reveals perhaps the most telling aspect of Rick's character. a man who despises higher powers while simultaneously acting as one. His battles with deities and godlike beings aren't just entertaining sci-fi scenarios, but windows into his deepest existential fears. Throughout the series, Rick consistently challenges the authority of godlike entities, making a point to confront and defeat them whenever possible. In Something Ricked This Way Comes, we witness him establish a competing business solely to undermine the Devil's Cursed Items shop. This isn't just petty rivalry, it's Rick refusing to allow any supernatural force to assert control over human lives. He doesn't just want to defeat the devil, he wants to prove that science can overcome even the most ancient metaphysical forces. After systematically neutralizing the curses from the devil's items, Rick and Summer even physically assault the devil, literally beating down a symbol of cosmic authority. These confrontations take on an even more direct form in episodes featuring actual deities. When Rick encounters Zeus and other mythological gods, he doesn't show reverence or even basic respect. Instead, he dismisses their claims to importance and authority. What's remarkable isn't just that Rick challenges these beings, but that he seems personally offended by their very existence. Each god represents a claim that something in the universe has inherent meaning or purpose. The exact idea Rick has spent his life rejecting. His refusal to acknowledge higher powers is more than simple atheism. It's an active campaign against any force that might suggest his life has a predetermined purpose. Perhaps the most revealing episode about Rick's relationship with higher powers is The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where we discover that Rick has created a miniature universe inside his car battery. The inhabitants of this microverse unknowingly generate power for Rick's car while believing they're developing clean energy for themselves. Rick doesn't just visit this universe. He designed it specifically to serve his needs, positioning himself as its creator god. When the microverse's top scientist discovers the truth and stops producing energy, Rick doesn't negotiate or explain. He threatens. He'll destroy their entire universe if they don't comply. This scenario exposes a fundamental hypocrisy in Rick's worldview. He rejects any suggestion that his own universe might have a creator with a plan, yet he creates a universe with exactly that dynamic. The people in his battery exist solely to power his car. They have a defined purpose imposed from above by a creator who will destroy them if they don't fulfill it. Rick embodies the very thing he claims to despise, a god who demands worship and service. When confronted with this contradiction, Rick doesn't even deny it. He simply asserts his right to do whatever benefits him, revealing that his problem isn't with the concept of gods, it's with being subject to anyone else's authority. These cosmic confrontations force Rick to face questions he'd rather avoid. If he can create meaning for the beings in his microverse, might there be something that created meaning for him? Rick's visceral rejection of this possibility suggests it frightens him more than any alien monster or interdimensional threat. A universe with inherent meaning would be one where Rick isn't the ultimate authority on his own existence, an intolerable thought for someone whose identity is built around total autonomy. Creator commentary has noted that Rick's God complex is a core component of his character, driving many of his actions throughout the series. This complex isn't just about ego, it's a defense mechanism against existential terror. By positioning himself as the highest authority in any room, Rick protects himself from having to confront the possibility that his life might be subject to forces beyond his control. His need to assert dominance over others, particularly over beings that claim divine status, stems from his deep-seated fear of vulnerability. Philosophically, Rick's battles with godlike entities represent humanity's struggle with questions of meaning and control in an apparently chaotic universe. His rejection of gods and authority figures reflects broader existential themes that the show explores repeatedly. When Rick dismisses Zeus or battles the devil, he's enacting a cosmic rebellion against the very idea that the universe contains inherent meaning or purpose. Yet his creation of the microverse suggests that even Rick can't fully escape the human tendency to impose order and purpose on existence. What makes these confrontations particularly revealing is how personally Rick takes them. When gods claim authority, Rick doesn't just disagree, he becomes enraged. His emotional investment in these battles contradicts his stated philosophy that nothing matters. If the universe truly has no meaning, why would Rick care so desperately about defeating beings who claim otherwise? His intense reactions betray that these encounters touch something deeply personal, a fear that perhaps he isn't as free from cosmic meaning as he pretends to be. Rick's encounters with godlike figures also force him to confront his own fears and insecurities. His battle with the devil serves as a metaphor for his internal struggles with morality and the consequences of his actions. Each confrontation with higher powers leads to moments of reluctant introspection, where Rick must briefly acknowledge that his rebellious stance might be more emotional than rational. These rare glimpses of self-awareness reveal the complex character beneath the cynical scientist facade. In various episodes, we see that Rick doesn't just reject gods, he actively tries to replace them. By manipulating events and people to suit his desires, he attempts to position himself as the highest power in any scenario. This behavior raises serious ethical questions about wielding such influence. When Rick plays God, he treats others as mere tools for his benefit, just as he does with the microverse inhabitants. His scientific genius allows him to exert godlike control, but unlike a benevolent deity, Rick uses this power primarily for self-serving ends. The existential contradiction at the heart of Rick's character becomes clearest in these divine confrontations. He wants absolute freedom in a universe with no inherent meaning, yet he craves control over everything in his path. He rejects the authority of gods while acting as one himself. He denies cosmic purpose while creating beings whose sole purpose is to serve him. These contradictions aren't plot holes. They're the essence of his character's philosophical struggle. The idea that nothing matters and acts accordingly. When faced with this dark reflection, Rick seems uncomfortable, not triumphant. It's as if seeing his worldview embodied by someone else reveals its flaws in ways he can't ignore. The fact that Rick doesn't celebrate evil Morty's nihilistic freedom suggests that deep down, he recognizes the limitations of his philosophical stance. Throughout the series, we see an ongoing pattern. Rick verbally maintains his nihilistic position while his actions increasingly contradict it. This isn't just inconsistency. It's the visible manifestation of an internal struggle between the comfort of his nihilistic worldview and the undeniable reality of his emotional connections. Rick wants to believe nothing matters because it's safer that way. If nothing matters, he can't be hurt, disappointed, or betrayed. But his growing attachments to Morty, Beth, and even the rest of the Smith family make this position increasingly difficult to maintain. The narrative arc of Rick's character illustrates this slow, reluctant abandonment of pure nihilism. Season by season, we see him begin to accept that meaning might exist, despite the vast, indifferent universe he inhabits. This is particularly evident through his evolving relationship with Morty. What began as a purely utilitarian arrangement has transformed into something much deeper. Something that looks suspiciously like love, though Rick would never use that word. What's fascinating about Rick's evolution is that it doesn't happen through epiphanies or dramatic moments of clarity. Instead, it occurs gradually, through small choices and moments of vulnerability that accumulate over time. Rick doesn't wake up one day and renounce nihilism. He simply finds himself making decisions that only make sense if some things actually matter to him. This subtle evolution raises intriguing questions about Rick's self-awareness. Does he recognize these contradictions in himself? Is he becoming more emotionally honest? Or is he simply unable to maintain his nihilistic facade in the face of genuine connection? The show rarely gives us direct access to Rick's internal thoughts, but his occasional moments of vulnerability suggest he's at least somewhat aware of his own philosophical inconsistency. We see this awareness most clearly in quieter moments, when he sits alone in his garage lab, when he watches Morty sleep, when he allows himself brief moments of genuine connection, before quickly covering them with cynicism or humor. These glimpses hint at a man who knows his stated philosophy doesn't fully align with his lived experience, but isn't ready to abandon it entirely. The significance of Rick's philosophical evolution extends beyond character development. It speaks to one of the show's central themes, the human need for meaning in a potentially meaningless universe. Rick embodies the tension between cosmic nihilism and the unavoidable human tendency to form connections and find purpose. His journey suggests that even for the smartest man in the universe, pure nihilism is ultimately unsustainable. What makes this evolution particularly powerful is that it doesn't feel forced or artificial. Rick hasn't suddenly transformed into an optimist or abandoned his cynical perspective. He remains the same brilliant, difficult, often selfish man we've always known. The difference is that now, despite his best efforts and continued protests, he cares. And that caring, that acknowledgement that some things do matter, represents the most significant crack in his nihilistic armor. Beneath Rick's reluctant acknowledgement that some things matter runs a darker current that explains nearly everything about him. The revelation in Rick Mirai Jack that Rick lost his wife and daughter at the hands of another. Rick doesn't just explain his pain. It exposes the silent redemption quest that's been driving him all along, even as he drowns it in nihilism and alcohol. This pivotal episode reveals that Rick isn't just running from meaning, he's haunted by it. When Rick Prime murdered his family, he didn't merely create a traumatic event in Rick's past. He created the central wound around which Rick's entire existence now orbits. Imagine carrying that level of loss across infinite universes, knowing that somewhere out there, the being responsible still exists. This isn't just grief, it's a purpose, hidden behind layers of cynicism and self-destructive behavior. The relationship between Rick and Rick Prime represents one of the most fascinating dynamics in the series. Rick Prime isn't just a villain, he's a dark mirror, the man Rick might have become without the transformative trauma of losing his family. Their conflict isn't merely about vengeance, it's about identity. Every time Rick confronts the idea of Rick Prime, he's confronting an alternate version of himself that chose different paths, made different choices, and perhaps never learned what it means to care about anything. What makes Rick's hidden quest for redemption so compelling is how it contradicts everything he claims to believe. This is a man who insists the universe lacks meaning, yet dedicates his existence to hunting down the specific Rick who took everything from him. If nothing truly mattered, why would this particular quest consume him across countless universes? The answer reveals the lie at the heart of Rick's philosophy. Some things do matter to him, so profoundly that he's built an entire persona around denying their importance. Consider the emotional weight of knowing that Rick Prime didn't just kill Diane. He erased her from every universe, amplifying the scale of Rick's loss beyond comprehension. This isn't just personal tragedy, it's cosmic erasure. Most people never experience loss on such a scale, yet Rick carries this knowledge every day. His quest isn't just about avenging Diane and Beth. It's about restoring something to the multiverse that was forcibly removed from it. In this light, his nihilism takes on new meaning, not as philosophical truth, but as the only way to function while carrying such catastrophic loss. Throughout the series, we see glimpses of Rick's remorse breaking through his carefully constructed facade. These moments aren't random character inconsistencies. They're windows into the real Rick, the man who exists beneath the caricature he presents to the world. When he makes genuine attempts to fix his mistakes or shows unexpected kindness, we're seeing the person he might have been without the trauma that reshaped him. These flashes of humanity suggest that redemption isn't just possible for Rick. It's what he's been searching for all along, without the vocabulary or emotional honesty to name it. Rick's relationship with the current Morty takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. While he claims to see Morty as interchangeable among infinite versions, his actions tell a different story. This specific Morty has become important to him in ways he can't articulate. Perhaps in protecting Morty, Rick is unconsciously attempting to atone for his failure to protect his daughter Beth. Every time he saves Morty from danger, often at risk to himself, he's rewriting his personal history, creating an alternate ending to the tragedy that defined him. Season 6 takes these themes even further, forcing Rick to confront the consequences of his actions more directly than ever before. The man who once moved effortlessly between universes, abandoning problems as they arose, now finds himself unable to escape the ripple effects of his choices. This evolution isn't just character development. It's the natural progression of someone slowly accepting that their actions have meaning, despite their claims to the contrary. Rick's growing inability to detach from consequences represents his gradual surrender to the reality that meaning exists, whether he acknowledges it or not. What's particularly fascinating is how Rick's occasional acts of selflessness connect to this hidden quest for redemption. These moments aren't random moral choices. They're expressions of the person Rick is trying to become, often against his own stated intentions. When he sacrifices for others or shows unexpected compassion, he's not betraying his character, he's revealing it. The true Rick isn't the nihilistic scientist who claims nothing matters. It's the man who continues to make connections and take risks for others, despite believing the universe offers no reward for doing so. The question that haunts both Rick and viewers is whether true redemption is possible for someone who's caused so much damage across so many universes. Can a man who has destroyed entire realities, abandoned countless families, and manipulated everyone close to him ever truly atone for what he's done? The beauty of Rick's character lies in this ambiguity. Rick himself doesn't believe redemption is possible, and perhaps that's precisely why he keeps pursuing it without admitting what he's doing. There's something profoundly human about continuing a quest you're convinced is futile. Rick's journey toward redemption is complex because it's happening against his will. Unlike traditional redemption arcs where characters actively seek to make amends, Rick is being dragged toward meaning and connection despite his best efforts to resist. This creates a uniquely compelling character study, a man whose actions increasingly contradict his stated philosophy, creating cognitive dissonance he can only resolve through elaborate justifications and deflections. Yet with each passing season, these justifications become harder to maintain. The most poignant aspect of Rick's unspoken quest is how it reveals the limitation of intellect in the face of emotional reality. Rick is arguably the smartest being in the universe, capable of bending reality itself to his will, yet he cannot escape the fundamental human need for meaning and connection. His brilliance allows him to see the mechanical indifference of the universe more clearly than others, but it offers no protection against the emotional need to matter. In this way, Rick becomes a profoundly relatable character despite his extraordinary abilities, a genius who can solve any problem except the ones that truly define his existence. Rick's intelligence might allow him to build portals between universes, but it traps him in a philosophical prison of his own making. For all his scientific brilliance, he remains unable to escape the most fundamental human question: how to find meaning in a universe that offers none. This paradox forms the emotional core of Rick's character, a man who loudly proclaims nothing matters while his actions scream otherwise. What makes Rick such a compelling character isn't just his scientific genius or his outlandish adventures, but how he embodies humanity's existential struggle. We all face versions of the same question Rick grapples with. In a vast, potentially indifferent universe, how do we create meaning? Rick's journey offers no easy answers, but it reflects our own search for purpose in surprisingly relatable ways. The philosophical underpinnings of Rick's character directly connect to existentialist and absurdist thinking. Like the writings of philosophers such as Camus and Sartre, the show suggests that individuals must create their own meaning in a universe that inherently offers none. Rick's story becomes a modern exploration of these philosophical traditions, with his scientific genius allowing him to see the mechanical indifference of the universe more clearly than others. Yet even with this awareness, he can't escape the need for connection and purpose that defines the human condition. Rick's evolution throughout the series mirrors this philosophical journey. After achieving his goal of confronting Rick Prime in recent seasons, he faces a new kind of existential crisis. With his primary motivation fulfilled, Rick must question what gives his existence meaning now. This development pushes his character into new territory, forcing him to confront questions about identity and purpose, without the driving force of revenge that previously anchored him. The most fascinating aspect of Rick's character is how his relationship with Morty gradually becomes the unexpected center of his meaning. While Rick initially viewed Morty as a tool, their relationship has evolved into something far more significant. Morty's presence serves as a reminder of the potential for connection and meaning, directly challenging Rick's cynical outlook. Their bond represents one of the show's most powerful statements about meaning, that it often emerges not from grand cosmic truths, but from the relationships we form and nurture. In this way, Rick and Morty uses its protagonist to comment profoundly on the human condition. Rick's struggle is universal despite his extraordinary circumstances. We all wrestle with finding purpose in a world that can seem random and indifferent. We all construct narratives and connections to make sense of our existence. Rick's journey differs only in scale, not in kind, from our own search for meaning. What's particularly striking about Rick's character is how the latest season highlights his ongoing evolution. After confronting Rick Prime, we see him questioning the purpose of his existence in new ways. Without his primary motivation, Rick must now face the frightening freedom of creating new meaning. This development reflects the existentialist concept that freedom can be terrifying when we realize we alone are responsible for creating purpose in our lives. The show's creators have indicated that Rick serves as a vehicle for exploring existentialist and absurdist themes, emphasizing the search for meaning amidst chaos. His character becomes a canvas for examining how individuals navigate the tension between cosmic meaninglessness and the human need for purpose. When Rick dismisses meaning with his nihilistic quips, but then risks everything for the people he claims are cosmically insignificant, we see this tension perfectly embodied. What makes Rick's journey so compelling is that he's fighting against his own awareness. His genius allows him to see the universe's indifference more clearly than anyone, yet he cannot help but care. His intellect tells him nothing matters, but his heart betrays him at every turn. This contradiction creates the rich inner conflict that drives his character development across the series. The beauty of Rick's paradox is that it offers viewers a chance to reflect on their own existential questions. When we watch Rick struggling to reconcile his nihilistic worldview with his growing attachments, we're invited to consider our own approaches to creating meaning. Do we, like early season Rick, hide behind cynicism to avoid vulnerability? Or do we, like Rick is slowly learning to do, accept the risk of caring in an uncertain universe? Rick's greatest discovery throughout the series isn't scientific but philosophical. Despite his resistance, he's gradually learning that meaning isn't found in the universe at large, but created through connection, choice, and even the struggles he endures. His journey suggests that perhaps the most authentic response to a meaningless universe isn't nihilism, but the courage to create purpose despite knowing how fragile and temporary it may be. This realization doesn't come easily to Rick. His character arc moves forward in fits and starts, with moments of growth often followed by regression. Yet the overall trajectory points toward a grudging acknowledgement that some things do matter to him, even in an infinite multiverse. His evolution suggests that creating meaning may be the most fundamentally human act of all, one that even the universe's smartest nihilist can't escape. As the latest season unfolds, Rick's story raises intriguing questions about his future development. Having achieved his long-held goal of confronting Rick Prime, what new purpose will he find? Will he continue to resist the pull toward meaning, or will he more fully embrace the connections he's formed? These questions don't just drive narrative interest but reflect back on our own lives and choices. Rick's journey reminds us that meaning isn't discovered like a scientific formula, but created through our relationships and choices. His reluctant movement from nihilism toward connection suggests that perhaps the wisest response to an indifferent universe is not to match its indifference, but to defy it through acts of care and commitment. In this way, Rick's character offers not just entertainment, but a profound meditation on how to live meaningfully in a universe that offers no inherent purpose. As we've journeyed through Rick's complex world, we discover the profound truth that makes his character so captivating as we drift toward sleep. Rick embodies our own existential struggle, claiming nothing matters while fighting desperately for the things that do. This contradiction isn't just compelling storytelling, it mirrors the human condition in an indifferent universe. There's something beautifully contemplative about watching a man who understands the cosmic insignificance of everything, yet can't help but form attachments, seek vengeance, and protect his family. Rick's reluctant march toward meaning, despite his intellectual rejection of it, creates the perfect mental space for us to contemplate our own existence as consciousness fades. As your eyes grow heavy, consider that we're all like Rick in some way, creating our own meaning through connections and choices, summoning the courage to care, even when we understand how fragile everything truly is. Perhaps that's the most human thing of all.